Good morning. My name is Elizabeth Karcher, and I had the pleasure of meeting many of you at the front door. I'm the executive director of the President Woodrow Wilson House. We are a site of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. That is not a bank. It is a historic preservation where we steward and take care of historic homes throughout the United States. I have been here for 4 years, and I will say I love having Edith in the program and having students come in here and having our student scholars this summer. It's one of the highlights for me to have students in the house. Why? For instance, for you, this weekend here in Washington, D.C., it's a big weekend. It's the 4th of July. I just learned the expression yesterday, which I love, and I have adopted, which is the celebration of Americans moving from subjects to citizens. Think about that. And we are the only country we have sustained that for over 200 years. There are other countries who've done it, but they have not sustained it. And that's unique. That sets us apart. And I think it's really wonderful that you're here on such a weekend, right just before the weekend of something so great. I came to this house 4 years ago. I grew up in New Jersey, and a young woman in your class is from my high school alma mater. It's an all-girls school. I was class of 53 students. She's class of 84 students, so the thought that we found each other is just remarkable. I have always had a passion for 20th century diplomatic history. That's what led me to study overseas, to do my graduate work in international relations. And then eventually it led me to this job here at the Woodrow Wilson House. So with that, if you ever have any questions about working here, if you're coming back to Washington, if you want to take a longer visit, please let us know. We would love to have you. So with that, we have someone who has worked here for a number of years. And so we have invited him back to be a speaker. He's actually worked in this house for longer than I've been, than I have. So with that, I'll introduce our speaker. Dr. Mark Benbow recently retired as an associate professor of American history at Marymount University. He earned his PhD from Ohio University, and from 1987 to 2002, he worked in the Directorate of Intelligence in the Central Intelligence Agency. From 2003 to 2006, Benbow was a historian for the Woodrow Wilson House Museum in Washington, D.C. Benbow has published 3 books to date, leading them to the Promised Land, Woodrow Wilson, Covenant Theology, and the Mexican Revolution, which is 1913 to 1915. It was published in 2010. The Nation's Capital Brewmaster, Christian Heinrich and His Brewery, 1842 and to 1956, which was published in 2017, and Woodrow Wilson's Wars, Woodrow Wilson as a Commander-in-Chief, which was just published in 2022. His articles have appeared in multiple scholarly journals, and he has published essays and books on Wilson, on American foreign policy, and in specialized reference works. He is currently mulling over, possibly writing, a book on Woodrow Wilson and the movies. So with that, I welcome Dr. Mark Benbow.
I've long been interested in Woodrow Wilson, just as a topic, starting with the 1968 election when I was in grade school, and our teacher, we had to do a report on a president for the presidential election, and I picked Wilson, and after that I was just kind of interested in it. So I worked here, I've written on him, my dissertation was on Wilson, and so on, and I'm happy to be back at the Wilson House and talking to you all. There's basically several takeaways that I want you to get out of my talk today, that lessons you can learn by studying Wilson's presidency. One is he trusted those who worked for him. He really gave a free rein to his cabinet members and his military commanders. As long as they didn't violate administration policy, hey, it was their department, you do it. He trusted expertise. That probably comes out of his experience as a PhD and a professor. that he respected those who were experts in a particular topic and listened to them. It doesn't mean he always took their advice, but it does mean he did have respect for those who knew what they were talking about. And he always kept in mind that he didn't have all the facts, that there was more to gather. He told somebody early in his first term, I not only use all the brains I have, I use all that I can borrow. And I thought that was a good piece of advice for leaders. And then one you can see that he didn't follow at the end to disastrous effect, and that was be willing to change your mind. Well, he obviously didn't when it came to the league ratification battle. He was better at that when he was younger, but we'll get to that. Now, as a historian, I'm all about context. I tease my wife that the most common phrase historians, no matter their subject area, have is yes, but. Because I constantly get people that say, oh, well, I heard that X, Y, and Z. And I'll say, well, yes, but. And then add some context to it. So I want to give you a little bit of Wilson biography. And some of you will know this, some of you won't. But it's to add context to how he approached leadership. He was born in Virginia, didn't live here long. His parents moved when he was a year and a half down to Georgia. Grew up in Georgia during the Civil War. One of his earliest memories is somebody running down the street yelling, Lincoln was elected, there was going to be a war. He lived in South Carolina, in Columbia during Reconstruction, and then when he was your age, his father and mother lived in Wilmington, North Carolina, and he spent time there. His adult life, of course, is further up north. He did go to UVA for a law degree, didn't graduate but passed the bar, which was pretty common at the time. You went until you learned enough to pass the bar, and then you left. Lived in Atlanta for a while, and hated being a lawyer. He thought it was mind-bendingly dull. Sorry, those of you thinking law school. But he went into law because he wanted to go into politics. He knew early on he wanted to go into politics. And then as now, the law was a very frequent path to that. Well, he's in Atlanta during the era of the New South and rebuilding, but so were a lot of other young lawyers on the make. He did get one good thing out of it. He met his future wife. So he was pretty happy about that result of it, but decided, I'm going to go and become a scholar. And he went to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore to get his PhD, the only president with an earned PhD. It doesn't have an exact equivalent to now. Roughly, it's a political administration doctorate. Both historians and political scientists claim it. But it was a lot fuzzier division between them. His dissertation was unusual. He had his dissertation published as a book, got great reviews, and he submitted it as his dissertation, which is kind of the reverse of how you normally do, but it worked. And then he became a college professor. Taught at Bryn Mawr, taught at Wesleyan, where he was also the football coach. Never think of Wilson as a football coach, but he was. And then, of course, most of his time at Princeton, which is where he did his undergraduate work. Became president of Princeton. Now, he was, again, always into the idea of being a political creature, whether elected office or later trying to influence future politicians. That was his goal. You know, if they had this kind of institute when he was your age, he would have been in it in a flash. And knowing Wilson, probably trying to rewrite a constitution for it, because he tended to do that in every club he joined his whole life. But that was his idea. Well, okay, he wasn't going to go into politics through law. He would influence future leaders and teach them the history of how governments formed and how representative governments worked. That's one reason why he didn't like teaching at Bryn Mawr. It was a women's college. And the 1880s, women's college, that's not future elected leaders as far as he could see, which is why he moved on to Wesleyan and then Princeton. Now, he wrote numerous books as a professor. His politics books are good. His book on congressional government is still a classic for its era. His book, The State, was a textbook, and it is the driest book you've ever seen in your life. Yeah, I swear, it really is. Even for a textbook, it sets new levels for just absolutely mind-bogglingly dull. It's very good in terms of the facts, but I think the Geneva Convention bans using it as a textbook now. It really is that bad. His history books varied in quality. His book on division and reunion was really interesting. It's about the coming and fighting of the Civil War and Reconstruction. Now, even though he is a native of the South and his father was a strong Confederate supporter, he has never been a lost cause person. He said he was happy the South lost and the Union survived. And so he didn't take the lost cause view that the South was right. What he did was kind of go down the middle. And it's one of the really early attempts in history writing to kind of divide between the Northern and Southern interpretation. And this is important because of the way and why he did it. He said, look, both sides had a point. He said when the Union was formed, the South was right. States wouldn't have joined it. They didn't have the right to leave the Union. He says, but the North was right in that the interpretation of the Constitution had evolved. And breaking apart the Union would have destroyed the country. He says both sides, the South that was using the old interpretation of the Constitution and the North was using the current interpretation. Wilson is very much into each generation evolving its understanding of how representative government works. In fact, one of the readings he recommends in that deadly dull textbook is Darwin. Now, he's from a family full of Presbyterian ministers. Now, more than you can count almost. Oh, not really that much, but a lot of them. His father, his grandfather, his uncle Woodrow, for whom he's named, was kicked out of the seminary where he taught for teaching Darwin. And Wilson always thought that was silly. Yeah, he's very much a devout Protestant Presbyterian Christian, but he didn't see the conflict between science and religion, and he got that from his uncle Woodrow. So he's a big believer in interpretations evolve over time. Now, his other history books are frankly dreadful. His book on the history of the U.S., 5 volumes, it's just awful. It's lightly researched. It's well written because he's a good writer, but it was written literally for money. He's a professor and he's got a very large extended family. He's married, they've got 3 daughters. His wife's parents had both died. Her mother died in childbirth. The father suffered depression, later killed himself. So they're raising his wife's eldest brother, who became Wilson's best friend, and her youngest sister, who's the age of their kids. They also are supporting and living with them as Wilson's aged father. So he's got a really big extended family on a professor's salary. So he wrote for money. And his history of the U.S. was a bestseller. And he got enough money out of it to have a nice house built in Princeton. His biography of George Washington, and there's a statue of Washington that I don't know if it's still there or not, was in the library, is even worse. The word twee, just basically, it was written purely for, I'll sell this and make a lot of money and it'll be in magazines. As a history, it's awful. And very quickly shoved aside. But he's basically a public intellectual. If you were like today, you'd see him on all the news channels and on C-SPAN, and they'd say, oh, here to talk about, such and such policy as Professor Woodrow Wilson of Political Science Department in Princeton. He'd be there with the little mic on and all that. And he'd have books that you would see out in the popular book section under current events. That's his role in the late 19th, early 20th century. Now, he makes a name for himself because he challenged the elite. Now, Princeton was, when Wilson went there, is the College of New Jersey. When Wilson is a professor there, you basically have two kinds of students. You got sons of Presbyterian ministers. That's why he went there. And you have rich kids whose daddies couldn't buy them into Harvard and Yale. So you've got these kids, okay, we're going to park them at Princeton. They'll get the gentleman's C minuses, and then they'll come back and daddy will give them a position in the company. Wilson actually started enforcing grades. And he starts kicking out students who did poorly regardless of how many science buildings daddy could buy for them. The students, there was a whiskey that was very popular at the time called Wilson, no relation, and their slogan was Wilson, that's all. It was a very popular whiskey. And the students published cartoons that said, Wilson, that's all, and it showed him on an empty Princeton because he's flunked out all the kids. And Princeton did not have fraternities. They had eating clubs. It wasn't a cafeteria. You joined an eating club. And the more money you had, the more exclusive and nice the clubhouse would be. And he said, this defeats the whole purpose of academia. We're supposed to be mixing these people and having them discuss issues and learning and teaching each other. You've got the really rich kids in this one and the slightly rich kids in this one and the middle class minister's kids in this one. Well, this just ticked off a lot of alumni because they had put, literally in many cases, a lot of money into these things. He also got into a battle over where the graduate school would be. The graduate dean wanted it way off campus because he wanted kind of a British model where they all eat together and live together. And Wilson wanted the grad students to mix with the undergrads to encourage each other. Well, a wealthy donor died and left a bucket load of money for the graduate school following the dean, not Wilson. So Wilson loses the battle over where the graduate school goes, and he's ticked off major number of alumni by trying to kill off their precious eating clubs. His time as president of Princeton's over. Well, he's recruited to run for governor of New Jersey. And this is where he really makes a national name for himself. He'd already come to people's attention. This is the era of Teddy Roosevelt and trust busting and questions about the really wealthy's influence on American politics. So taking on the eating clubs had already developed some attention. And as governor of New Jersey, he takes on the northern New Jersey Democratic political machines, literally kicks one of the political bosses out of his office. Basically frog marches the guy out of the office when he came to ask for a favor. So he does, after a long battle and primaries, 1912 was the first election in which we have a lot of primaries, get the Democratic nomination. Of course, the Republicans split. Taft, the incumbent, gets the Republican nomination. Teddy Roosevelt leaves and forms the Progressive Party. It's really hard to tell the difference between Roosevelt's program and Wilson's. Very, very little daylight between the two. But with the Republican split, Wilson wins, comes in with the progressives that will vote for his program as well as the Democrats. He has a large majority in Congress. Now, Wilson, his policy, like Teddy's, is to try to balance out power centers. Wilson is very much into the government supposed to represent the larger body of the people. And of course, how he would define those people is very different in 1912 the way we would today. But nonetheless, he's thinking large electorate, large number of people. And there's a lot of concern over the trust and monopolies, all those, what they used to decades ago call the robber barons, these giant industrialists that had enormous political as well as economic power. And so his policy, like Teddy's before us is trying to balance out the competing interests. And he's he really believes in the power of words in discussion. He's the first president to address Congress in person since John Adams. Jefferson hated speaking in public, so he started sending messages to Congress as a note which would be read by the clerk in the Senate and the House. Wilson copied the British model of Parliament, which he really admired. He thought we should go to a parliamentary system because it was more responsive, he said, to the voters. You put out a program. If you get a majority, you run the government. You lose the majority, the other guys come in. He thought that was much more responsive. But he starts addressing Congress in person because he really believes that words and discussion have enormous power in self-government. And even his enemies admitted he was really good at this. Henry Cabot Lodge and Wilson hated each other's guts. And Lodge, on one of Wilson's speeches, was like, "Oh, this is nonsense on stilts." Of course, it's well expressed. Kind of a grudging respect by Lodge for Wilson's skill in this. He also learned how to weigh sources, and this is very important. Because there is no one clearinghouse to get information to the president at the time. His secretary, Joe Tumulty, he was basically his chief of staff, would give him clippings from newspapers from around the country, pro and anti-administration, every day. And there were several newspapers he really trusted. The New York World was one he trusted the most. And in writing my dissertation, which became my book on Wilson, Mexico, I went through the different major papers in New York and found its reporting actually was the most accurate. Not that they were always accurate, but certainly they were better than the other papers, including the New York Times. And the World becomes known as Wilson's mouthpiece. When the administration leaks something, it tends to go to the World. But he had the World, he had the Springfield Republican out of Massachusetts. He got tons and tons of mail. I almost said email. They have a way to read it though. I got tons and tons of mail, which the secretary would give him some. But he tended to weigh it on a couple of factors. What access to information did the source have, and what ulterior motives might they have? So example, when he gets a letter saying it's time to invade Mexico, you're like, well, this guy owns tons of railroad miles in Mexico. He has a specific interest in it. Now, the influence, you'll be talking about his wives as first lady. Ellen, his first wife, dies in August of 14 of kidney disease. Ellen was really, she was educated, she was smart, she spoke multiple languages. Wilson was probably dyslexic and had struggled with foreign languages. And his first wife translated really heavy German philosophy for him to use as research. And one of the philosophy professors at Princeton said she understands Hegel better than anybody on the faculty. She could get him to change his mind. He'd go off on a tirade, and she'd say, "Oh, Woodrow, you don't believe that." And he'd say, "Well, I did." And open his mind back up. She dies. He marries Edith little over a year later. This was Edith's house. Edith has at most a 3rd or 4th grade education. She speaks some French because she's a clothes horse and went clothes shopping in Paris all the time. But worst of all, she won't get Wilson to change his mind. And when Wilson goes on a tirade like he does in 1919 over the treaty fight, she doesn't say, "Oh, Woodrow, maybe you should listen to Senator Hitchcock. He has some points." Nah, Edith is all like, "You get him, Tiger." Oh, I love when you're a big, strong president like that. You know, that's not what the country needs in the fall of 1919. Now, keep in mind in your discussion several things here when we talk about relations between the different parties. You can't say either party in this time is the Liberal Party and that's the Conservative Party. Both parties are very, very wide coalitions. Both parties have a liberal wing, a moderate wing, and a conservative wing. And they vary on strength from time to time, and there's a great deal of overlap. So when Wilson is dealing with Congress, he's dealing with, depending on the issue, a lot of his own party, a lot of the progressives who tend to agree with the Democratic platform, and depending on the issue, one wing of the Republican Party, usually the moderate or liberal wings. So keep that in mind in your discussions. That's very different. The coalitions are still fairly wide when Reagan's president, but nowhere near as wide as they are when Wilson was president, and certainly did not have the division today. So again, for Wilson, keep in mind, he trusted his underlings. He trusted the people he chose, and he didn't choose by party all the time. His main general in Europe, the head of the American Expeditionary Force, is John Pershing, who's not only a Republican, his father-in-law is a Republican senator, and usually an opponent of Wilson. But Wilson thought he could do the job best. His best Secretary of War, a man named Baker, was a progressive Republican who had been a Teddy Roosevelt supporter, but was a really good administrator, and Wilson tapped him for that. He respected that so long as you didn't violate administration policy. If Pershing didn't wander into diplomacy, Wilson's orders to him in World War I were quite simple. Take an army to Europe, win the war, tell me what you need. And when the Allies complained about Pershing, they'd go to Wilson, and Wilson's like, that's Pershing's role. The Brits and the French want American troops. What's Pershing say? He says no. It's no. Wilson knew he had no military expertise. Now, I will mention, I'll close with this. Wilson has a very unique experience among American presidents. We've had lots of presidents who were combat vets. From they were in the rear the whole time to actual decorated, oh my God, you survived that, war heroes. Wilson's the only president that saw war as a child. Andrew Jackson saw the revolution as a teen. But Wilson is basically a primary school student. He's about 8 when his father's church in Augusta was used as a Confederate field hospital, and his job was to put straw down on the floor between the pews to soak up the blood. If you've ever seen depictions of what an amputation in a Civil War hospital was, imagine seeing that multiple times when you're 8 years old. He's the only president we had with that experience. We've seen presidents with in combat, the guy next to him was killed. Teddy Roosevelt, or going up Sand Hill, the guy next to him had his head blown up. It's the only one who saw it as a small child. And that really affects, I think, how he views sending troops into combat and how he relies on his military. I got a lot more on here. Of course, there's interventions, there's the treaty fight. You always have to keep Wilson's health into account. His health was terrible. Of course, he has a major stroke in October 1919. But again, what I want you to take out for leadership is he does see it as, I'm the leader, but I have this support that a good leader will use. And when he fails at the end, it's because he's abandoned that support, and he's abandoned listening to those that he had listened to before. Going it alone for Wilson turned into a disaster. I'll end on one quick humorous story. Somebody asked him, because he gave a lot of speeches for money when he was a professor too, and somebody said, how long will you take to prepare? And he says, well, how long do I speak? If you give me 10 minutes, I need a month to prepare. If I can speak for an hour, I need 2 weeks to prepare. If I can talk as long as I want, I'm ready right now. That's how I feel about my topic here too.
Something that drew you to President Wilson, other than just you decided to use him for your project, like something about him that really drew you?
That's a good question. There's no one thing that attracted me to him. I've long been interested in the early 20th century as a historian. It's familiar enough to be understandable, as opposed to like my buddy, I was telling you guys about the alligator photo that does medieval history. That's just too odd for me. I have no idea what's going on. But it's different enough to be interesting. I always tell my students, I would love to visit the 19 teens. No way in hell I'm living there. I'm not going anywhere without air conditioning and antibiotics. Not happening. But give me a day in New York in 1917, I'm there. But I'm coming back to the 21st century and my wife and air conditioning. Yes, sir.
How do you reconcile Wilson's very progressive foreign policy with his regressive domestic policy?
Could you repeat the question?
How do I reconcile his foreign policy and his domestic policy?
Yes.
Well, he's very much, an interventionist in foreign policy. Some of that, though, I would argue is situational. That Dominican Republic and Haiti, for example, when we occupied them in 1915, 1916, are what now we call a failed state. And his intervention in Mexico in 1916, Pancho Villa had raided into the U.S. and killed a bunch of Americans. He did give a little too much leeway in Pershing chasing Villa. Pershing went way too deep into Mexico. Almost got into a war with Mexico. We got into a war. Some captain decided the way to get promoted, because promotion was really slow in the U.S. Army at the time, was to be a war hero, and picked a fight with the Mexican army and lost. And Wilson had to negotiate for the release of American POWs from Mexico. One reason the captain wasn't cashiered and court-martialed was he was one of the casualties who was killed in the battle. Other interventions, occupying the port of Veracruz in 1914, he was told we'd be greeted as heroes. The Mexicans will recognize we want to get rid of their dictator. No, they saw us as a bunch of Yankees invading their country. Interestingly, when the military then said we have to keep going to Mexico and occupy Mexico City, Wilson said, no. You are not going outside of the city limits. Set up a perimeter on the outside of the city, and you are not to go an inch farther. They were going over that line. Yeah. Yes, sir.
So I've heard before that Edith Wilson had like pretty significant influence over Wilson kind of after his stroke.
Edith?
What
Oh, yeah.
was that the case?
She was more of a gatekeeper than anything else. The treatment for a stroke at the time was keep you quiet and isolated. And his doctor, his secretary / chief of staff, and Edith, anything that upset him could kill him. So she doesn't make policy. His Dr. Grayson doesn't make policy. Tumulty sometimes made decisions. His secretary, but he had been Wilson's secretary since he was governor and knew his mind. Didn't know anything Wilson wouldn't have done. It's like Wilson's veto of the Volstead Act to enforce prohibition was probably tumulty, but Wilson agreed with it. So she's more gatekeeper than anything else. Yes?
Yes. Why did President Wilson go by Woodrow and not Thomas?
I think he just thought it sounded better, and he really liked his Uncle Woodrow. He went by Tommy and then Thomas, and then when he was about your age, switched to Woodrow. I think he just thought it sounded better. It's got that WW thing going. Yes, sir, in the back.
Could you describe the intervention in Haiti, and do you know how Wilson felt about the Haitian Revolution in the 19th century?
That's a good question. I haven't seen much of anything in his writings about the original Haitian Revolution. As a Southerner, he's probably very paranoid about, but by the time he's old enough to have an opinion, it's post-Civil War. But he would have grown up with it being a horror story from when he was in school. And that was true both in the North and the South, but especially he would have learned that from his teachers in Georgia. That intervention was more the military and the State Department with his permission than his ordering. Haiti had come to the point where they're having new presidents every year, You hire an army, attack Port-au-Prince. The previous president loads up as much money as he can and flees to the French ambassador's house, which conveniently had a door connecting the Haitian president's office to the French ambassador's home. All he had to do, the revolutionaries marching up Port-au-Prince, grab up some suitcases full of money that you took from the treasury, open the door, and you're escaped essentially to French territory. Well, the last president, a guy named Sam, and that's his last name, not his first name, to prevent this, basically ordered the massacre of all of the young men of the prominent families in Port-au-Prince. This was just not done. And when the prominent families in Port-au-Prince find the prison and find dozens and dozens and dozens of their young men had been hacked to death by machetes, they attacked the French ambassador's house and literally tore President Sam to pieces. And when the U.S. Navy ship that was there reported there was unrest showed up, was the captain see through his spyglasses, but they're parading the body parts of the president through the streets, including his head on a pike, set on a stick. And so they start moving Marines and Blue Jackets in to protect the foreign citizens, and one thing led to another. Now, that doesn't go into what happens afterwards with the long occupation of Haiti, with the guerrilla war that was fought in Haiti in the 20s. All that is post-Wilson, but at the time, it's because this is a failed state. And weirdly, they worried the Germans would take advantage of it. This is during World War I. That's not quite as weird as it sounds, because Haiti had a law that non-Haitians could not own property in Haiti. A lot of Haitian business, though, were dominated by German businessmen who married Haitian women. They're therefore Haitian. Now they can own a business. So it's not entirely insane to think Germany during the First World War might dominate Haiti, because Germans did dominate what little industry there was. But it wasn't realistic in the long run. Sorry, that's a really long answer. I'm sorry. I'll try to keep the next one much more succinct. Yes.
My question is about Wilson and his time in the South, and
Yeah.
how that affected how he governed the country domestically.
Yeah, he did, to a large part, adopt the states' rights. For example, women's suffrage. He supported it not as a constitutional amendment at first, but as an individual state matter, and made a very big deal about traveling to New Jersey to vote in favor of the referendum for women's suffrage in New Jersey. It lost. He comes around at the end of the war to support the constitutional amendment, but he did kind of latch onto and maintain a lot of the individual states have the right to do these things. Is that enough? I'm trying to be succinct, but still answer.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
You said that the policy agenda of Roosevelt and Wilson was surprisingly similar.
Yeah.
So how does Wilson differentiate himself from Roosevelt? I know that Roosevelt liked to put a lot of effort into displaying himself as a super masculine, cowboy-like statesman. So did Wilson depart from that, or how?
Yeah, Wilson didn't play on that. They really played up this would be a third term. Which, of course, perfectly legal in 1912, but not done, because George Washington said 2 is enough. What, you think you're better than George Washington? Which was really the argument. And Roosevelt had served 7.5 years. So he tried to say this wouldn't really be a third term, and Wilson, the Democrats, really played up, yeah, this would be a third term. The guy who shot Roosevelt, tried to assassinate him, that's a great, famous story, I won't go into here, but you know the story. Did it because he thought Roosevelt would keep running for office forever. Yes, sir.
How else did Wilson's background is intellectual affect his presidency, and how did that set him apart?
How did Wilson's background in?
As an intellectual.
I think that's where you get the emphasis on words and discussion. His PhD program was modeled on the German model, because that's where his professors got the PhD. That's where the PhD is invented. And that was very heavy into the seminars. It was, you all do lots of reading, write a paper on original research, and then we all sit down and hammer it out together. So I think that really, emphasized, that really strengthened his already existing view in the value of discussion, which to some extent he got from his religious faith too. Presbyterian Church is very big on representative government discussion, and a lot of the Southern Presbyterian Church meetings were held in his house because his dad was clerk of session, which meant he's basically one of the guys running the day-to-day business of the Southern Presbyterian Church. So Wilson grew up listening to discussions and deciding issues through discussions, and I think his graduate school time really emphasized that. That's a good question. I've never gotten that one before.
One last one.
One last one. Somebody hasn't asked one before? Go ahead. Go for it.
Why did Wilson change his mind into entry into the Great War?
A lot of reasons. He wanted a place at the peace table, and as a belligerent, we're guaranteed one. There was a very active German sabotage campaign in the U.S. That was blowing things up. Germans really were trying to get the U.S. into war with Mexico. Austria-Hungary was involved too, but Germany's by far the senior partner. And then unrestricted submarine warfare. At that point, public pressure is so great. Wilson was having a hard time resisting it, and I think he thought at this point there is a genuine threat to national security, and you can't underestimate he really wanted a place at that peace table. And you'll note we did enter World War I as an associated power, not an ally. Because Wilson's trying to maintain a little bit of distance for the peace conference.
Thank you.
Good question.
Let's give,
Thank you.